The surrender ultimatum hung in the air of the Zarathi throne hall like a blade nobody had the courage to lower, and High Sovereign Malkaroth Zeal expected silence or pleading or the particular desperate bargaining he had watched a dozen conquered species attempt before bending the knee. What he got instead was laughter, not nervous laughter, not the broken laughter of a species facing extinction. Genuine, unhurried laughter from the human ambassador, standing alone before a throne carved from the bones of a moon, surrounded by an honor guard of soldiers twice her height. "You want us to surrender," said Ambassador Dana Whitcomb, wiping an actual tear of amusement from her eye, "to an empire that took 11 years, 4 failed invasions, and the deaths of 6 admirals just to convince us you were worth taking seriously." Malkaroth's jaw tightened, mandibles clicking with barely restrained fury. "You are alone, human. Your fleet is scattered, your homeworld sits within striking range of my armada. Explain to me what, precisely, you find so amusing." Dana straightened, and something in her expression shifted from humor into something colder, sharper, infinitely more dangerous. "We're not laughing at your threat, Sovereign. We're laughing because you think this is the first time we've heard it, and because in 6 hours you're going to understand exactly what this species does the second time someone declares a final war on us." 3 days earlier, none of this had seemed like it was building toward a throne room. The Zarathi ascendancy had spent 11 years trying to break humanity. And for 11 years humanity had refused the one thing every conquered species before them had eventually surrendered: the assumption that resistance was temporary and defeat was inevitable. The ascendancy's first invasion, launched with the overwhelming confidence of an empire that had never lost a war in 4 centuries, had ended in a humiliation Zarathi historians still struggled to explain to their own people. Human forces, outgunned and outnumbered on paper, had fought not with superior technology, but with something the ascendancy's rigid caste-based military doctrine had never accounted for: total, improvised, decentralized resistance, where every human commander adapted independently to battlefield conditions instead of waiting for orders to filter down through a command hierarchy built for obedience rather than initiative. The second invasion failed for different reasons. The third and fourth failed for reasons the Ascendancy's War Council still argued about behind closed doors, each defeat costing more resources and more prestige than the last, until finally, after 11 years and thousands of lives on both sides, Malkaroth Zeal had decided the only path left was total, unconditional demand for surrender, backed by the largest armada the Ascendancy had ever assembled. What Malkaroth did not know, what humanity's diplomatic corps had spent 11 years carefully ensuring the Ascendancy never learned, was that Earth's true military strength had never been the fleet the Ascendancy kept fighting. It was something humanity had built quietly, patiently, in the deep space between the two territories, ever since the first invasion had made it brutally clear that humanity could not win a war of attrition against an empire with 1,000 worlds and endless reserves. Admiral Corinne Achebe, the officer who had commanded Earth's forces during that first impossible victory, had spent the following decade building something the Ascendancy's intelligence networks never detected: an alliance. Not with a single powerful species, but with 17 smaller civilizations scattered across the Ascendancy's border regions, each one previously conquered or threatened by Zarathi expansion, each one waiting for a reason to believe resistance might actually succeed. That wasn't even the most carefully guarded secret Earth had kept for 11 years. The alliance Corinne built wasn't merely diplomatic. It was industrial, military, and technological, a coalition that had spent a decade quietly retrofitting captured Zarathi weapons technology, human engineering innovation, and the specialized expertise of a dozen alien cultures into something none of the individual civilizations could have built alone. They called it the Conquered Fleet, and by the time Malkaroth Zeal issued his final ultimatum, it numbered over 4,000 vessels, hidden across 17 systems, waiting for the single signal that would bring them all into motion at once. Dana Whitcomb had known this walking into the throne room alone, unarmed, surrounded by enemies twice her height in a chamber built to intimidate. She had volunteered for this mission specifically because Admiral Achibi needed someone inside Zarathi space when the signal went out. Someone who could confirm, in person, that the Ascendancy's leadership had been fully committed to their final ultimatum before the Concord fleet made its irreversible move. It was, by any reasonable military calculation, close to a suicide mission. Dana had accepted anyway. Because she understood something about the war that Malkaroth's rigid command structure had never allowed him to consider. Sometimes the bravest act available to a soldier wasn't fighting. It was standing perfectly still, alone, while an empire decided whether or not to become the villain of its own history. 6 hours, Malkaroth repeated, his voice dropping into something quieter, more dangerous than his earlier fury. You expect me to believe a scattered, defeated species has assembled some hidden force capable of threatening the Ascendancy in 6 hours? I don't expect you to believe anything, Dana said. I expect you to watch your sensor arrays, Sovereign, because in 6 hours, 17 systems along your border are going to stop pretending they're loyal subjects of your empire. For the first time since the negotiation began, something flickered across Malkaroth's expression that hadn't been there before. Doubt, thin and reluctant, but undeniably present. The rehook came not from the throne room, but from what was happening simultaneously 4 systems away, aboard Admiral Achibe's flagship, where the true scale of humanity's decade-long gamble was about to be tested for the first time in actual combat. Corinne stood on the bridge of the Concord fleet's command vessel, watching the countdown tick toward 0, aware that if even one of the 17 allied civilizations lost their nerve in the final hours, the entire coalition could fracture before it ever engaged the enemy. Fleet status, she asked, and her communications officer, a Threll Asani engineer named Vural Kest, who had lost his entire home system to Zarathi expansion 2 decades earlier, answered with a steadiness that belied the tension in the room. All 17 fleets report ready, Admiral. Nobody's backing out. Corinne allowed herself exactly one breath of relief before the next problem arrived. A junior officer at the edge of the bridge, a nervous ensign named Priya Okonjo, who had joined the fleet straight out of the academy and had never seen live combat, spoke up with a question that cut through the room's careful calm. Admiral, what if Ambassador Whitcomb doesn't make it out? What if the signal goes out and she's still standing in that throne room? Corinne's expression didn't waver, though something in her eyes tightened. Then she knew that risk before she walked in, Ensign, and she made her choice anyway. Our job now is to make sure that choice meant something. Then let's make sure Dana's message lands, before we give them a reason to change their minds. Malkaroth's War Council convened an emergency session the moment his sensor officers confirmed unusual fleet movement patterns across 17 separate border systems. Patterns that had gone completely undetected by Zarathi intelligence for years. Fleet Marshal Threxavol, the Ascendancy's most decorated commander and Malkaroth's oldest rival within the court, did not hide her fury at the failure. How does an alliance of this size assemble undetected across our own border for a decade? Someone in this room has failed catastrophically, Sovereign, and I want to know who. It was a fair question, and one the Ascendancy's leadership would spend years trying to fully answer, because the truth, that 17 supposedly loyal client species had spent a decade quietly preparing rebellion under the nose of an empire too confident in its own supremacy to imagine such coordination possible, was almost too humiliating to accept. The battle that followed was not the massacre either side expected, and this was the twist that would be studied by military historians on both sides of the war for generations to come. The Concord fleet did not attack the Ascendancy's core worlds first, and it did not attempt the kind of overwhelming decisive strike that Zarathi doctrine assumed any rational commander would pursue. Instead, Admiral Achibe ordered something that confused Ascendancy tacticians for the first critical hours of engagement, a series of precise, coordinated strikes against supply lines, communication relays, and troop transport routes across all 17 border systems, simultaneously, systematically dismantling the Ascendancy's ability to reinforce or coordinate its response. without ever directly engaging the massed armada Malkuroth had assembled around humanity's homeworld. It took Malkuroth nearly 4 hours to understand what was happening, and by the time he did, the realization arrived with the force of a physical blow. "They're not trying to defeat our fleet," he said quietly to Fleet Marshal Vol, staring at a tactical display that had transformed from confident superiority into creeping isolation. "They're trying to defeat our Empire's ability to function as a single coordinated force. If they succeed, this armada becomes nothing more than 4,000 ships with no supply lines, no reinforcements, and no way home." Vol's expression, for the first time in the 11 years Malkuroth had known her, showed something close to genuine fear. "Then, Sovereign, we no longer have the luxury of demanding their surrender. We need to consider offering our own." But the true climax of the war arrived not through fleet maneuvers, but through a single decision made in the Zirathi throne hall, where Dana Whitcomb still stood, unarmed and alone, watching 6 hours become 7, then 8. As Malkuroth's court dissolved into chaos around her, Malkuroth turned to her at last, his earlier fury replaced by something far more complicated. The specific, disorienting humility of a leader realizing his empire's 4 centuries of unbroken conquest had finally met a species patient enough, disciplined enough, and quietly determined enough to outlast it. "You could have destroyed my armada from the beginning," he said. "Instead, you spent a decade building an alliance capable of paralyzing my empire without a single major battle. Why?" Dana's answer, when it came, carried none of the earlier laughter, only quiet, hard-earned conviction. "Because we learned something in your first invasion that took 11 years to fully understand, Sovereign. Killing your soldiers wouldn't end this war. It would just guarantee the next one. We didn't want another war. We wanted this to be the last one." The negotiations that followed lasted 3 weeks, and they were unlike any treaty the Ascendancy had ever signed with a conquered or resistant species. Malkuroth, humbled but not broken, agreed to withdraw all forces from human and allied territory, to formally recognize the sovereignty of all 17 Concord civilizations, and to submit to an unprecedented oversight council, designed to prevent future invasions before they could ever begin. Fleet Marshal Vol, who had spent 11 years believing conquest was the only language the galaxy respected, found herself unexpectedly moved when Admiral Achebe extended an invitation to the newly formed Concord Council, rather than treating the Ascendancy as a permanently subjugated enemy. "You could have humiliated us completely," Vol admitted during the final signing ceremony. "Why extend a hand instead?" Corinne's answer echoed something Dana had said in that throne room weeks earlier, a philosophy that had guided humanity's entire decade-long strategy. Because an empire we humiliate today becomes an empire planning its next war tomorrow. We didn't spend 10 years building this alliance to create more enemies. We built it to finally stop making them. Word of the Concord's victory spread across the border regions within days, and the story that emerged was unlike anything the Ascendancy's neighboring civilizations had ever heard about humanity before. Not the story of a fragile species that got lucky in a distant war, and not the story of conquerors who simply traded one empire for another, but something the galaxy would remember for generations. 17 civilizations, led by a species once dismissed as too young and too scattered to matter, who had chosen patience over vengeance, and had rewritten what victory could look like in a galaxy that had never known anything but conquest. Dana Whitcomb stood at the edge of the new Concord Council chamber months later, watching delegates from 18 worlds argue, disagree, and slowly, imperfectly, learn to build something together instead of tearing each other apart. She thought of the laughter that had started it all, and she understood now that it hadn't been mockery at all. It had been the sound of a species that had finally stopped being afraid of a war. It had already decided, quietly and patiently, that it would never lose again. Somewhere in that chamber, Fleet Marshal Vol caught her eye across the room and offered the smallest, most unfamiliar gesture Dana had ever seen from a Zirathi officer. A nod, not of surrender, but of respect freely given between equals. Dana returned it, and for the first time in 11 long years of war, the silence between two former enemies felt like the beginning of something worth calling peace.